My name is Jafar. I'm a policy coordinator at European Horizons, and I've predominantly been working on the Fall Policy Workshop. My expertise lies in policy memos, both from a professional background as well as an academic background. And today we're going to give a masterclass on how to write a good policy memo. Before we begin, though, I'd like to give thank you to European Student Think Tank for providing this excellent opportunity for our students to write a policy memo for a competition. Do remember that this policy competition will actually allow some of our memos to be read by actual MEPs. So this is an incredible opportunity, so do try and take part. And also I'd like to tell you a little bit about European Horizons. European Horizons is a student-led policy incubator. Our mission is to provide a voice to the youth in Europe and across the world, which extends more so from just voting. We want to provide an avenue for us to influence decision makers in more of a legislative way. And policy memos are a key way in doing this. So yeah, a little bit more about myself. I'm a third-year philosophy, politics and economics student at UCL. And today I just want to briefly go over our policy guidelines. Having gone over policy guidelines, we'll go through an example of a really good policy memo, and then any questions that anyone has, we'll answer them in a Q&A session towards the end. In the meantime, this is a recorded session, so please do try and keep your microphones on mute. And as far as cameras go, you can keep them on or off. It's completely up to you. So yeah, bear with me as I'm about to share my screen. Okay, perfect. So first things first, what is a policy memo? So a policy memo is basically an example, a way for experts, or a way for someone to provide expertise to decision makers or policy makers. And so the key thing about a policy memo is that you really want to provide a specific and in-depth advice about a specific option that the decision maker can take on. And so the key thing that all policy memos have are the following sections: an executive summary, an introduction, problem description, policy options, and recommendations. So I'm going to go through each of these sections, highlight the key things that one must try and include in each of these sections, as well as some common mistakes that people make. If at any point you have any questions, please do note them down. We'll try and answer them at the end of this session. So first things first, the executive summary. Now, the executive summary can be sometimes a false friend, in the sense that even though it is your first paragraph, it is actually something that you should try and write at the end, once you've written your whole policy memo. This is because an executive summary, as it says, it should summarize everything that you are arguing for within your policy memo. Within 100 to 200 words, you should be able to outline what exactly you're recommending and why the reasons for your recommendation are. So the common mistake with the executive summaries is that often people start to write their executive summaries and almost treat it like an introduction. Please do not do that. And instead, make sure you begin at your introduction when you're writing your policy memo, and only once you have written your whole policy memo do you then attempt to write your executive summary. The next section is introduction. So the introduction is a really important section, in the sense it allows you to outline the policy memo and the area that you're going to explore further. Now, you should remember that given that a policy memo is written for someone who is a decision maker or policy maker, they already have expertise in what you're talking about. And so this is an opportunity to provide, specific technical understanding of whatever area you are trying to recommend a policy to be implemented in. So in your introduction, you try and basically set the background context, highlighting why this is, what the problem is, and why it falls within their remit. The key thing about an introduction is that it should pretty much try and avoid being a repetition of your executive summary. And secondly, it should be pretty brief, from 200 to 250 words, and focus on setting out what you think is relevant information. Try and avoid mentioning irrelevant facts that just do not relate to later parts of your policy memo. Having established your introduction, you go on to your problem description. And in your problem description, this is one of the most important parts of the policy memo, because it allows you to specifically identify one problem in the status quo. We want you to, having identified that one problem, the status quo, we want you to think about why this is such an important problem, why this problem also needs to be addressed right now. Those are two things that you should try and ask yourself when writing the problem description, because it's really important that not only do you establish that this is a problem that needs to be dealt, but it needs to be dealt now. Furthermore, in your problem description, you want to subtly highlight how this falls within the remit of your decision maker or your policy maker. That way, you, by the end of your problem description, you have highlighted a problem which is important, that needs to be addressed, and falls within their area of policy making. The common mistake that occurs with problem description is that people sometimes try and identify too many problems. Focus on one problem with the status quo. That way allow you to get more in depth and try and really properly analyze the problem on hand. Second problem that people often find is that they miss out the question why this problem needs to be addressed now, or they miss out why current status quo policies are not working. So really make sure you ask yourself, what is the status quo, what is wrong with it, and why this problem is so important. Once you've established your problem, we move on to policy options. Now, in your policy options section, we want you to set out multiple, so about 2 to 3 policies which will tackle the problem that you described earlier. Now, in your policy options, the first thing you should do is establish the mechanism of how your policy would work. So what I mean by that is, what exactly is your policy? How would it fix the problem that you've highlighted earlier? Having established the mechanism, it's really important to evaluate your policy option. Highlight what are the strengths of your policy option, what are the weaknesses of your policy option. As you go through the different policy options that you have, what you should be trying to do very subtly is establish that one of these policy options is better than the other. Now, there are multiple ways of doing this, and I'll highlight these a little bit later on when we're analyzing the excellent policy brief later. But one way of doing so is basically addressing that one of the specific policy options has or encompasses the advantages that other policy options have without having the negative or drawbacks that some policy options do. The key thing about policy options is to make sure you avoid giving only one option. And this is because what you want to do is provide the decision maker or the policy maker a thorough analysis of the options that they have. And when you only provide them one, it almost sends a signal to them that you were a little bit lazy and do not necessarily have the expertise to be able to judge what are the different ways of tackling this problem, or B, the policy maker might think, actually, while they suggest this policy option, I think an alternative might be better. And given that you haven't addressed why alternatives will not be better, it might mean that your policy option isn't actually accepted. Secondly, a really common mistake in policy options is that sometimes people try and include strawman arguments. And what I mean by strawman arguments is basically purposely putting in a bad policy option to make your policy option, the one that you're recommending, look better. Now, please do try and avoid this. There are a couple of reasons why. The first reason is that if you provide the 3 or 2 best potential policy options, and then are still able to explain why your specific recommendation is better or is the best one, then that's only going to make your argument a lot stronger. Secondly, policymakers are going to be able to see through this. You got to remember that the people you're writing to are very intelligent and they're very capable to understand when a straw man is being put in place. A final key problem in policy options is that sometimes people just put the policy should be just an increase to funding. While that is a legitimate policy option when it comes to increase of funding, it's really important that you highlight where you're going to get the funds from and why the money spent on fixing this problem is worth it. This pretty much goes for any policy option that you do recommend. Always try and acknowledge and evaluate its strengths and weaknesses. Having gone through your policy options, you should then use a recommendation to fully establish why one particular policy option out of the 2 or 3 that you recommended is the ideal option. In your recommendation, it's really important that you go beyond evaluation and start offering potential ways to either mitigate or overcome some of the drawbacks within your policy. Now, it doesn't matter how amazing your policy option is, almost always there are going to be some sort of drawback. And so what that means is, in your evaluation, it's really important that you highlight what these drawbacks are and then provide the policymaker a way to overcome this, B, a way to make this less problematic, or C, provide them a reason for why that this problem is, it's worth it, that the problem we're fixing is so important that it doesn't matter if we get backlash from a specific group or if it costs a lot of money. At the end of the day, it's more important focusing on fixing the problem. The recommendation should be relatively brief, 150 to 300 words. And what's really important about a recommendation is that anyone should be able to read your recommendation and understand the fundamentals of your of exactly what you're recommending and how exactly it's going to fix your problem. That's roughly roughly what sections there are in a policy guideline, a policy memo, and I've briefly gone over what they should try and include. I know I've gone a little bit fast, so if there are any questions, please do write them down. We will come back to them. In the meantime, I just want to also try and emphasize that it's really important when you do write a policy memo that you use Chicago-style referencing. This is particularly useful, and you'll see in the example memo why it looks better to have Chicago-style referencing. A second thing that I really wanted to emphasize is that when you're writing a policy memo, spend some time doing research on not only the policy problem or the problem that you're trying to fix, but also who exactly you're writing to. It's really important because you want to understand what their incentives are, what their remit is, what capabilities do they have. At the end of the day, you can write the most amazing policy memo ever, but if the problem falls outside of their remit, or if the policy that you've recommended is something that simply cannot bring through, then your policy memo achieves nothing. And so that's why it's really important that you tailor your policy memo to the specific person that you're writing to or the organization you're writing to. So having gone through that, I will go through an example policy memo. 1 second. Okay, so here we have a policy memo on European energy integration. So just a little bit of brief background about this policy memo. The idea of this policy memo is to recommend to the European Union to implement a new European trading system, implement a carbon tax in order to overcome the shortcomings of the European trading system. So I've highlighted, and by the way, this example policy brief is available in the description or the chat, so do check it out if you want to have a more in-depth look. But what this policy memo does really well is, first of all, in its executive summary, you can read the executive summary and you know exactly what they're recommending and the reasons for why they're recommending this is the case. So I've highlighted what exactly they're recommending, and you can see the 2 reasons. This is excellent because what it means is a decision maker or policy maker, they can quickly pick up this memo, and just by reading these 4 or 5 lines, they know exactly what this memo is going to entail. This is really important because you have to remember decision makers and policy makers, they're often short on time, and that means that it's really important to be concise and get to the point. Within the introduction, the key thing that they do really well is that they establish the fact that this problem that they're going to be discussing falls within the remit and within the goals and incentives of the European Union, and also that this is and it also provides some background information about the actual problem that they're going to go more specific into. So I've just highlighted briefly looking at how they do this by saying, this is a supreme goal of any European energy policy. And so what this does is that it makes sure that the policymaker or decision maker understands that what they're recommending is of value, is of importance, and is something that they should definitely consider. Within the problem description, what they do really well is highlight the status quo, which is what they do in the first couple sentences, and then immediately they go into what the problem with the status quo is. Now, this is incredibly important, and the key thing that they do really well is that they reference specific figures, specific research and analysis of why the problems in the status quo exists. Now, as you can see, the way they've referenced is through Chicago style or footnote style. And the key advantage of this is that it doesn't detract from the reading of the policy memo. So it's one of the key reasons why we do really emphasize trying to use a Chicago style referencing. So going back to the problem description. So not only do they establish the problem with the status quo, they also establish why current policies that are in place to try and fix this are simply not enough. And so what that means is it really established that this is an important problem and that currently there doesn't exist, no real solution exists yet. And so this leads on to the policy option. Now, this is something that they could improve on by providing policy options instead of a single policy option, which is something that I really want to emphasize, that when you are writing your policy memo, please do make sure you at least recommend 2, ideally 3 different policy options. Nevertheless, what they do incredibly well with their policy option is that they establish the mechanism of how exactly this would work. They explain to me why this is a realistic solution, why the existing knowledge why there is existing capabilities and knowledge out there to start putting this policy into place, and why there's already infrastructure around to allow this policy to occur. Furthermore, it highlights what this policy does better than the status quo. So here they say, thus, the tax is not only revenue neutral, but also avoids putting higher stress on consumers, fostering inequalities and aversion against climate action. They've highlighted one of the key strengths of this and made sure to kind of speak to the incentives of the European Union, which is obviously to make sure consumers and inequalities as well as climate action is taking place. Furthermore, they acknowledge some of the shortcomings on raising tax on carbon emissions, and provide a potential way to overcome these shortcomings. And this is a really important aspect, because what this does is that it mitigates or helps the decision maker to favor their policy option, because they're able to overcome potential problems. Finally, we go on to the recommendation, and the key thing we see in the recommendation is that they contextualize the problem. So obviously this was written pre the UK leaving the EU, but as you can see, they were trying to take advantage of the UK leaving the EU and see how actually this does propose a reality in which this policy option is now a possible and realistic recommendation, while previously it was not. What this is really clever in doing is it explains to the policy maker or decision maker that, hey, you might have come across this idea before, but the reason it wasn't okay before was because of X, but now that X is no longer a variable, we can now consider our recommendation. This is a really clever way of establishing why this recommendation is feasible, and it's something that we should all try and do when we're writing policy brief, is contextualize your recommendation and say why exactly it is feasible. Finally, it does acknowledge some of its shortcomings in the recommendation, but nevertheless highlights why this policy is worth it. And overall, and that is the reason why this policy brief overall is a really, really excellent policy brief. And please do give a read of it when you have, if and when you have some time, as it will give you a good background on how to write or how to structure and write your policy brief. So that was pretty much everything that I wanted to go over. If I've gone quite fast, I'm sorry, but please do ask any questions or anything that that you want further clarification on. To help answer these questions as well, we've got the policy coordinator at European Horizons, Philip.
Yes, thank you so much, Jeff. That was a very good introduction on a lesson and lecture on policy memo writing. Yeah, keep your questions coming. I will bridge the time a bit by introducing myself as well. My name is Philip. I'm the Director of Policy at European Horizons. I was one of the co-authors of the previous policy memo, and surely it would have been a better memo if I would have attended this masterclass. Yeah, I have a background in electrical engineering and political science, and will join the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy this summer. And yeah, I mean, it's probably one of those examples where you can see that if you have a background where you're really familiar with the topic, it surely helps you in crafting the memo. Nevertheless, I think it's nothing that cannot be overcome by very good research. We have one very good question here from Aman. He is asking regarding the recommended structure within the policy options section. So for example, if there's a certain order in presenting the arguments that would be particularly convincing for policymakers.
I think that's an excellent question. And one of the ways I like to phrase my policy options to make it particularly convincing is that I like to make sure that the last policy option that I provide is the best one. So what I like to do is start with the first policy option, and in my mind to try and the first one I introduce, I make it such that it is out of the three the worst one, but obviously make sure it's still a strong one. And then as I go through each of them, I highlight how the second policy option has some of the advantages that the first one has without as many drawbacks. And the third one encompasses the advantages of 1 and 2 without having as many drawbacks. Another way of doing it is by having policy option 1, which has positives X, while policy option 2 has these positives Y, while policy option 3 has X and Y without having as many drawbacks. And that's just a subtle way of kind of like road mapping someone into accepting that your policy option is the best one. Furthermore, the reason I like it having being the final one or the third or second one is because then it allows me, it springboards quite nicely into your recommendation, because what you've done is you've spoken a little bit about your policy option, and now you're able to explain it further in your recommendation and establish why exactly it is the best policy option. So I hope that answers your question.
Amazing. It seemed it did, according to his message. We have one more question from Katerina. She's asking what to do if you're not entirely sure on whether your recommendation or your policy option is feasible and where to get the funding from.
That's an interesting question. And I think the key thing with this question is that ideally research should help you overcome that problem. And I know this seems like a little bit of a cop-out answer, but it is, it's one of those things where you really need to make sure you do the research to understand whether or not your policy is genuinely feasible. If, however, you find there isn't much research out there, then what I would do is try and see if you can find similar policy options in other areas. So maybe you're recommending something for the EU, you can try and look at some policies that were implemented in North America or in the next country and say what shortcomings they had there and see if it's potentially feasible on a supranational level. On the flip side, maybe you can look at an EU policy and then say you want to recommend it in your country. And so what I would do is hopefully research will try and help me overcome that. But if not, I would genuinely try and see if I can make any comparisons between similar policies. And if not, then ideally I would probably avoid using that policy recommendation in the first place, because if you are really struggling to find whether or not it's feasible or whether or not you can even source the money, then it does beg the question whether it is feasible. If you are really genuinely passionate about the policy option, then what I often do is if you find it's difficult to find source the money, or I would just use a normative argument. And what I mean by a normative argument, I would just use an argument which relies on the philosophical necessities for this policy. Now, for example, you can use that the reason why we have to have more new refugee camps is because of our responsibilities towards global or social justice. Now, what that does is it justifies your policy option normatively without necessarily needing any empirical evidence. And that's one way of overcoming difficulties when you can't really find the research or when your policy is a bit niche.
Amazing, thank you. We have one more question from Rose. She's asking, could you comment on the tone of the memo? For instance, when working in communications, we often use emotive language in order to persuade. Should this be avoided in a policy memo?
Yeah, I would pretty much say try and avoid emotive language. A really good advice I had is nouns and verbs, try and avoid adjectives pretty much, because like that way it allows you to be quite concise with your policy memo. But yeah, you don't really want to necessarily use emotive language, but at the same time, you do want to be subtly convincing. So in your problem description, what I would do, like the best way, instead of using emotive language, emphasize their incentives to influence them. So look, and this is where it goes back to researching what exactly are their aims. Now, for example, imagine you're writing, so I'm British, and imagine I was writing to the Conservative Party. So the Conservative Party have particular people that vote for them, and it's really important for them that they implement policies which make sure that they stay on board, or that they implement policies which wins them new voters without scaring away the traditional voters. So what I would do in my policy problem description is say, hey, by not fixing this problem, your voters will no longer vote for you, or new voters won't vote for you, and that's not going to allow you to win any elections. So instead of using emotive language, what I've done is use their incentives against them or to influence them to act. And I think that's the key way I would recommend to write a policy brief. It's quite formal overall. So yeah, that's the way I would try and keep your tone.
Amazing. That's been all questions as it looks like. Thank you so much, Jafar, for your amazing masterclass once again. Thank you everyone for joining. I think it's been a pleasure, and I would give Jafar the last word for the evening.
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you again to European Horizons and European Student Think Tank for organising this competition. I really, really recommend taking part in this competition. This is an excellent opportunity to improve your policy memo writing, and also you will actually potentially get a chance for genuine MEPs to read your policy memo. So who knows, you might actually influence them into do further research or implement your potential policy recommendation. So do get involved, and do check out other European Horizons events. We've got, hopefully we'll have more events in the policy making, but we've also got other events. So do check us out on LinkedIn or on Facebook.